Veteran waitress, humiliated, called Scarface, a combat nurse who once risked her life to save others under heavy fire. No one asked about her story. Because who really cares about veteran stories buried beneath faded aprons and war-scarred skin? Until a teenage boy stood up. He raised an old photo and said just 6 words: "She saved my dad. Twice." The diner fell silent. And from that moment, justice began to return to the one who should have been honored all along. You're watching a true story from Justice for Veterans. Her name is Grace Thompson, 34 years old, former Army nurse. She once ran into enemy fire to pull a wounded soldier from the rubble. The IED blast in Kandahar left her alive, but with a scar running from cheek to collarbone, one that would never fade. After being discharged, she knocked on dozens of doors, only to hear, "We're looking for someone with a more positive appearance." No one asked about her medals. No one cared she saved 13 lives. Eventually, she took a job at Linda's diner. Wearing a faded uniform, her hands slightly trembling, eyes always cast down. Each day, she poured coffee for people who didn't realize they were being served by a hero. Every morning, Grace arrived 10 minutes early. She wiped counters, stacked plates, brewed coffee, her hands a bit shaky, but her movements still precise, a remnant of military routine. Children stared. Parents pulled them away, whispering, "Don't point, it's rude." One man laughed loudly. "Great breakfast. Shame the server ruins the appetite." Grace smiled faintly. Her eyes lowered. Her hand clenched the tray handle until her knuckles turned white. She whispered to herself, "Just get through today. Tomorrow will be easier." But tomorrow never got easier. She once saved strangers in war zones. Now, the familiar faces around her avoided her eyes, as if afraid her pain was contagious. Cheryl Dean, one of Grace's co-workers, set a coffee mug on the counter and muttered. Table 3 asked if someone else could serve them. They said she makes them nauseous. Linda, the diner's owner, overheard but simply nodded. "Okay, have Grace stay in the kitchen and make salads instead." Grace heard it all. Every word felt like a needle under her skin, but she nodded and stepped behind the curtain. No more lights, no more voices, only the soft hum of a ceiling fan and her tattered apron hanging motionless on a steel hook. She glanced at the small mirror taped behind the fridge door. One scar, one face, and a silent thought in her head. Joel, you're used to this, right, Grace? Sunday morning. The diner was packed. Grace served coffee to table 6 middle-aged men in suits, talking loudly. One glanced up and smirked. "Careful, boys. Her scar might salt the coffee." They laughed. Grace kept her composure. Another man deliberately dropped a glass, shards scattered beneath her feet. "Clean it up, Scarface," he sneered. Grace knelt down, hands shaking, picking up broken pieces. Behind the counter, Linda stood frozen, then approached and spoke softly, but loud enough for all to hear. "Grace, I think you should take the rest of the day off. Too many customer complaints." No defense, no sympathy, just weak laughter and a dismissal notice. Grace stood up, brushed her hands. Blood trickled from her cut finger. She untied her apron, folded it neatly, placed it on the counter, like a soldier returning their uniform. No one said a word. Cheryl glanced, then turned away. Linda stared blankly. The men at table 6 kept eating, laughing. Grace walked slowly toward the door. Each step felt like dragging her entire past behind her. Outside, the wind was cold. She paused for a second. Her eyes swept across the room one last time. No goodbyes. No farewell glances. She was used to that. But she didn't know someone had been watching from the corner booth, where a silent teenage boy hadn't moved the entire time. The boy's name was Ethan Miller, 16 years old, wearing a gray hoodie, sitting silently since the beginning. He hadn't smiled, hadn't touched his phone, just quietly watched Grace and the scar on her neck. As Grace touched the diner door, Ethan stood up. He pulled an old yellowed photo from his backpack. He walked toward the center of the room, His voice shook but was clear. "Everyone. You all see her scar, but none of you saw this photo." He held it high. A young nurse, covered in blood, cradling a wounded soldier amid smoke and rubble. "This is my father, and the person saving him is Grace." The room went silent. Forks stopped clinking. Linda frowned. Cheryl froze. No one said a word. Ethan took a deep breath, still holding the photo high. He looked around, locking eyes with everyone, and said each word clearly. She saved my dad. Twice. The room froze. A woman dropped her coffee. A man near Ethan exhaled sharply, eyes wide. Ethan continued, voice steadier now. "Once on the battlefield, and once, when my dad nearly ended his life from PTSD, it was Grace who called the ambulance. She brought him back. And now, you're firing her over a scar?" No one spoke, not even Linda, who could no longer hide her shame. Silence lingered. Then the soft scrape of a chair. An elderly man stood up. Silver hair. Old blazer. A Marine Corps pin glinting on his chest. He stepped in front of Grace, who had turned back after hearing Ethan's voice. His name was Walter Green, a Vietnam veteran. He raised his hand in a formal salute. "Ms. Thompson, I'm sorry, we forgot you." Grace stood frozen. Her lips tightened. Her hand trembled, but she stood tall. A middle-aged woman nearby started clapping. Alone at first, then more joined in. Linda stood behind the counter, eyes wet, mouth opening and closing. Cheryl stepped back, unable to look anyone in the eye. The atmosphere in the diner had completely changed. Linda stepped out from behind the counter, holding the apron Grace had left. She looked at Grace, then down at her hands as if the apron weighed more than anything she'd ever carried. Her voice trembled. "Grace, I didn't know. I truly didn't know." Grace looked Linda in the eyes. No anger, no resentment, just a silence too deep to be forgiveness. Linda bowed her head. Her voice cracked. "I let profit drown out decency." Behind her, Cheryl stepped forward. She gently placed a hand on Grace's shoulder and whispered, "I'm sorry. I was wrong." Ethan still stood in the center of the room, watching it all unfold. He had done what no adult dared. Stand up for justice. From that moment on, Grace was no longer just a waitress in their eyes. That very day, Grace's story spread like wildfire. A customer had recorded the moment Ethan raising the photo, Walter's salute, the standing ovation. Within 24 hours, the Department of Veterans Affairs reached out. A warm voice over the phone said, "We've overlooked you for too long, but if you're willing, we'd be honored to have you speak for the veterans still living in silence." Grace sat quietly, looking at the same hands that once served coffee in shame, now holding an invitation of honor. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was just surviving. She was starting to live again. Weeks later, Grace stood on stage at a mental health conference for veterans. She didn't cover her scar. She didn't lower her gaze. She spoke of that night in Kandahar, of the first soldier she saved, David Miller, and of the second time when she talked him down from the edge with just one phone call. The room was silent, then burst into applause. In the front row sat Ethan and his father, eyes red, hearts full. From that day on, Grace became the voice for the unseen, for the veterans whose wounds weren't always visible, but who carried war inside them. Together with Ethan and David, she traveled to schools, hospitals, care homes. They shared stories, listened deeply, and healed not just others but each other. She was no longer the waitress. She was Grace, a hero risen from the ashes. A formal ceremony was held at Ethan's high school. Flags waved in the wind. Students sat upright in rows. On stage, Ethan held a microphone, wearing a simple blazer, eyes shining bright. He looked down at the guest section, where Grace sat beside his father, David Miller, now healthy and smiling. Ethan spoke, his voice clear and full of emotion. "Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear aprons and serve breakfast." The room erupted. Grace stood, bowed slightly, tears running down her face, but her lips still smiling. That day, She needed no titles, no medals. She only needed to know that they finally saw who she truly was. A month after the ceremony, Linda's diner looked different. It was no longer a place of whispers and shame. On the wall opposite the entrance, a brand new wooden plaque had been mounted, etched in gold letters, Veterans Wall of Honor. At its center, a photo of Grace, wearing her combat nurse uniform, bandaging a soldier amidst ruins. Below the frame, a quiet yet powerful inscription, courage that serves every day. Linda stood in silence, staring at the wall. Cheryl wiped tables nearby and bowed her head slightly each time she passed the plaque. New customers asked, "Who is she?" Linda would smile softly, her voice like a whisper. "She's the one I wasn't good enough to keep." Not everyone who wears a uniform is called a hero, and not every hero is treated fairly when they return. Grace Thompson saved dozens of lives in combat, yet nearly vanished under judgmental stares in peacetime. Only when a boy stood up did the world begin to look inward. Justice for veterans isn't a medal. It's how we treat them every single day. At Justice for Veterans, we believe no one who fought for this country should ever be forgotten when they come home. If you are moved by Grace's story, please share it, because there are thousands of Graces out there still waiting to be seen.